Test number 8. Locating invoice amount totals that are greater than the associated purchase order amount. Our goal is to locate invoice totals that exceed the purchase order amounts stated for these invoices. We could design a single group totals query that has criteria established for performing this selection. However, to break the steps down for achieving our goal, we will create multiple queries showing just one step in each query. First, we will relate the invoices paid table to the purchase order table. Then we will create, with the query's wizard help, a summary query to summarize the invoice amounts by purchase order numbers. In a third query, we will create criteria to locate invoice totals that are greater than the associated purchase order amount. Finally, we will create another query from this last query to list the invoice totals that exceed their purchase order amount by greater than 50%. We will start by creating the first query as a simple selection query relating two tables. To begin, in the query window, we will use the Create a Query in Design View option. We will need to select and relate the Invoices Paid table and the Purchase Order table. By double-clicking on these two tables, we can add them to our Query Design View. After closing the Show Table box, we need to relate these two tables on the field that ties them together. The PO number field can be found in both tables. We will relate these tables on this field by dragging one field and dropping it on top of this similar field in the other table. Next, we will add the fields we want to display in this selection query. We will choose the PO number field from the Invoices Paid table as well as the invoice amount field. From the Purchase Order table, we will select the Purchase Order Amount field. We don't need to add the PO number for the second table. With the relationship that we have established, the PO numbers would be the same for both these matching records. When we run the query using the Run button on the Query toolbar, Access displays invoice records that are attached to purchase order records. Notice that there are multiple records displayed using the same PO number. Invoices without PO numbers or with numbers that don't exist in our purchase order table are not displayed in this datasheet view. We will save this query by clicking the Save button and naming it Invoices with PO Amounts, and then we will close the datasheet view. For the second query in this process, we will create a summary query. The results of this query will display invoice amounts summed for the associated PO number. We will use in this exercise the Query Wizard to help us with the design of what will be a group totals query. In the first wizard window, we will select the query that we just finished, Invoices with PO Amounts. We will want to use all three fields in this query, and we will select them all at once by clicking on the double arrow button. In the next dialog box, we will choose to summarize the records and sum the invoice amount field. We will not want to sum the PO amount field, as this amount is the total for each purchase order number. In the next dialog box, we will rename this query Summary of Invoice Amounts. We are finished with designing the summary query. Displayed in the datasheet view are the three selected fields. Access has summed invoice amounts by PO number, so there is one sum of invoice amounts for each PO number and PO amount. Upon examining the PO amounts with these summed invoice amounts, we recognize that the values are very different. For some records, the PO amount value is greater, and for others, the sum of the invoice amounts is greater. Our goal is to locate the records where the invoice sum is greater than the PO amount. In our next query, we will accomplish this. We close the query to begin a third query. We will use the design view to create our third query. In the Query Design window, we will add the last query we created, Summary of Invoice Amounts. We will find it by clicking on the Queries tab in the Show Table box. By selecting this query, it will allow us to use summed records to query on. We will select all fields for this query. A shortcut way of adding all fields from an object to the Query by Example grid is to double-click on the title bar of the object and drag the highlighted fields to the grid. Now all of the fields in the selected object are included in our grid. Let's run this query as is to count up the number of records that we are working with. There are 13 total PO records. We will return to the Design view to continue designing our query. Clicking on the first button on the Query toolbar will quickly take us back to this view. We only wish to view records where the sum of the invoice amount is greater than the PO amount. In the Sum of the Invoice Amount column, we will add criteria to the criteria row in the grid. The expression greater than will be used in conjunction with the PO amount field. When you use a field in an expression, the field name is enclosed in square brackets. We will type in the expression greater than purchase order amount. The field name must always be spelled exactly as it is in the displayed object. Running this query will display records that meet our criteria. We will use the Run button to see our results. There are 4 invoice totals of the 13 purchase order records that are greater than their PO amounts. Let's save this query, naming it Invoice Totals that Exceed PO Amounts. We will return to the Design view for one more addition. Clicking the first button on the Query toolbar will once again bring us back to this view. For this last effort, we want to see if any of these displayed records are more than 50% greater than their PO amount. We will add to the criteria 1.50 times the PO amount field. Now only records that exceed their PO amount by greater than 50% will be displayed. When we run the query, we see 3 of the original 4 records. These invoice totals are way above their contracted PO amount. The 50% figure is one that we set. You may choose to look for totals that are over their contracted amount by 5%. Even a 5% difference could be an invoice problem.